Gary Numan is a pioneer of electronic music, an icon of the late 70s post-punk scene and a legendary musician. His work in popularising the use of synthesizers has made an impact that can still be felt today, and his music is still played and loved some 4 decades later. His smash hit Cars has become something larger than itself. Shooting to number 1 on release in August 1979, the song was one of the first of its kind and has appeared in countless forms of media. In an advert for Carlin in the 90s, on a GTA Vice City radio station, more recently in Wonder Woman 1984. The song is clearly iconic, and you didn't really need me to tell you that. But Gary wasn't always the synth pioneer and legend that we know him as. In 1979, alternative music in the UK was in a strange place. The death of Sid Vicious in February was a nail in the coffin for punk as we knew it. Acts once lumped under the punk umbrella like Blondie, The Damned, The Jam, etc. were beginning to experiment beyond the pigeonhole of the reductive label, incorporating more instrumentation and nuance to their sound. Some groups like Joy Division would take a full gear shift from another angry punk-by-numbers band to a pioneering post-punk powerhouse. And in amongst all this mess was Tubeway Army. Formed in '77 at the height of the punk explosion, they were another London-based punk band formed by one Gary Webb. After playing shows at venues like the Roxy and the Marquee Club, they secured a record deal with Beggars Banquet and released the single That's Too Bad to little fanfare. The follow-up single, Bombers, failed to chart at all. During this time, the group put a stop to live shows completely, as for more often than not, punk shows ended up in violence. During a gig with the Skids, the violence was so bad that the show was cancelled halfway through. This would be Tubeway Army's final performance. At this time, Webb took on the stage name Gary Numan, pinching the name from a plumber in the Yellow Pages. Tubeway Army's debut album was the first instance of Numan utilising synth. Story goes that Gary had songs written for a 3-piece punk band when he stumbled across a Moog Mini-Moog in the studio. In an interview on Nights with Alice Cooper, Gary recalls his first time on the instrument.
So my move into electronic music was purely because of an accidental meeting. I went to a studio to record what should have been a debut punk album, and there was a synthesizer in the corner. Never seen a real one before. By the time they'd finished unloading the van and setting everything up, I'd already changed everything. I thought it was amazing. Nothing. Hadn't heard anything like it. And so they set up and they walked into the control room to speak to me, and I said, well, forget that. It's all different now. We're going to be doing this.
The result of this mashup of punk and synthesizer resulted in the self-titled debut record Tubeway Army. Only pressing 5,000 copies originally, the album produced no singles, didn't chart at all, but completely sold out. It's the follow-up that really got the ball rolling for Numan. Tubeway Army's follow-up record, Replicas, saw the group take more steps away from punk and deeper into synth-pop territory. Numan explains how he intended to write a book inspired by the works of Philip K. Dick and ended up writing a concept album. It was all about what I thought London might become in the future. I'd read these articles about gangs that were roaming around the London Underground and beating people up, which is where the Tubeway Army band name actually came from. And that's where the idea of most of these sci-fi stories came from. If that sort of thing continued and got worse, what would London be like in the next 50 years? Then I discovered synthesizers, and I just stuck the two together. The combination of dystopian lyricism with forward-thinking synth usage, in stark contrast to Tubeway's contemporaries, made the album reach number 1 in the UK charts and receive gold certification by the BPI. Songs like Down in the Park add some perspective into Numan's horrifying dystopian fantasy world, with imagery of killer machines hunting humans that live underground. And opener, Me I Disconnect From You, tackles themes of isolation and alienation, a theme that will extrapolate across Numan's career. From what I can tell, the music press were very apprehensive to show love, and reportedly even showed some contempt for this totally anti-mainstream music. Doing a bit of digging through some old copies of The NME and The Melody Maker and some others, around the time of the album's release, there is very little coverage on Tubeway Army and Replicas, despite its success. There is a piece from music mag Record Mirror, which gives us a very mixed perspective on the album, quote, Replicas is visual, evocative, occasionally ringing with excellence, but also damaged by intermittent lapses into pretentiousness. When the machines rock, they will sound like this. For the record's 30-year anniversary re-release, magazines like Record Mirror and Smash Hits re-evaluated their take on the album, largely providing rave reviews, in hindsight after the previous 3 decades proved this record's importance. Our Friends Electric was a standout from the album and became a hit in its own right. It was written on an old out-of-tune pub piano and was the result of Numan mashing 2 unfinished songs together. Gary says about the song, "You can't dance to it, it doesn't have a chorus, it's really long, and it's about robot prostitutes. If the BBC knew what it was about, they'd never have let me go on Top of the Pops." Our Friends Electric is a brilliant early example of synths in popular music, but certainly wasn't the first. Probably most notably, Kraftwerk had been around since the early 70s, and were a source of inspiration, but perhaps not in the way you might think. In a 2013 interview, Numan says this about Kraftwerk's impact on his style. "I'd listened to Kraftwerk before, and I'd liked it, but I hadn't found it exciting enough to actually do it. It's only when I stumbled across the synth and just by luck happened to have conventional instruments and added electronics to it. It's the mix of those sounds that I thought was exciting." The single, despite Numan saying it had no hook line whatsoever, topped the UK charts in May '79 and stayed at number 1 for 4 weeks, in part due to the exposure they gained from a Top of the Pops performance. By the end of 1979, it had become the 4th highest selling single in the UK that year. The precedent had been set for things to follow. Due to a bit of a row with Beggar's Banquet, the name Tubeway Army was dropped as Gary moved towards an electronic direction. The label wanted a punk record, which is the reason Tubeway Army was signed in the first place. Out of sheer confidence that electric music was the next big thing, Numan stood his ground. The compromise was that new music was released under Gary's name and not Tubeway Army. Gary says that the band was essentially his solo project anyway, so it was more of a formality than anything. So under the name Gary Numan, music was already being written and recorded as the previous record was climbing the charts. Instead of promoting the record, Numan was in the studio with John Peel, testing out new material. By the time Replicas was at number 1, the recording of Gary's first solo record, The Pleasure Principle, was underway at Marcus Music Studio in Kensington. With a newfound agency, Gary ditches all guitars in an effort to distance himself from punk as much as possible. On the 7th of September 1979, the world was exposed to the record, to nothing short of amazement. Numan had proven to the world that his hunch was right. Electronic music was the next big thing, and he was showing everyone else how it was done. The album absolutely stinks of 80s before the decade had even begun. The heavy use of synths before they were the zeitgeist, the futuristic lyricism, even down to the album cover. The Pleasure Principle by René Magritte provided inspiration for the title as well as the album art. Numan's cover is a take on the painting, only with less natural elements like wood and more clean, sharp, cold, futuristic imagery. While not strictly a concept album like the previous, The Pleasure Principle continued the lyrical themes of a dystopian future. Gary describes it as more of a collection of thoughts I'd had about the way technology was evolving and where it would take us. The NME said about the record, although the groundwork was laid down by lots of clever folk long ago, nobody has done what Gary Numan is doing right now. And the Melody Maker, the face of '79, doesn't belong to a mod, punk, or to anyone so sectarian, but to Gary Numan. Gary's contributions to pop shook the foundations of what pop actually meant, sharing the charts with the likes of Sham 69, Joe Jackson and Shawaddy Waddy, among others. It was clear that Gary stood on his own pedestal. The record entered the charts at number 1 and stayed there for a fortnight, managing to last in the top 100 for 22 weeks. And of course, the record was heralded globally, in large part due to the unprecedented success of one of the greatest, most recognisable songs of that era, Cars. It was released as a single in August '79 and quickly became a sensation, reaching number 1 in the UK and charting in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Germany, Ireland and more. The song was conceived from the first notes Numan had played on a new Sherry-Gold modulator bass guitar and was completed in 10 minutes. In an interview with Billboard, Gary calls Cars the most poppy song he's written and admits that he thinks he isn't a very good pop writer despite the song's continued success. In Numan fashion, the song tackles themes of isolation and alienation in a futuristic setting in which he truly feels safest in his car with the doors locked. The song was inspired by an incident of road rage. Gary recalls the incident in an interview with Professor of Rock.
I was driving along and some people in front obviously really upset with me. Anyway, they got out of their car and they're screaming and shouting at me and trying to open my door and I'm locking my doors, stay in the car. And I thought, there's no way I'm getting out of this. I'm going to get hammered.
The car acts as a metaphor for shutting away the real world and forcing isolation. It may feel safe, but it's pretty lonely and can warp your perception of the outside world. Also a curious thing to note, the song's vocals end at the 1 minute 30 mark, with another 2.5 minutes or so of instrumental just to play out. This could be a play on the themes of isolation and observance in the track. Cars was huge in the UK, peaking at number 1 and staying in the top 40 for 9 weeks, and was a surprise hit in America, hitting number 4 on the Cashbox Top 100 and number 9 on the Billboard 100, making Cars Numan's only real hit in the States. The Guardian have called it one of the greatest singles in pop history, and through its legacy and continued relevance, it's clear to see why. Cars is a staple of 80s nostalgia and electronic music history. Gary Numan's transition from the punk-inspired Tubeway Army to the electronic sound of cars marked a pivotal movement in the evolution of pop music as the world knew it. He helped popularise synthesizers in mainstream music and laid the groundwork for the synthpop movement of the 80s, influencing countless artists along the way, from Rammstein and Nine Inch Nails to Lady Gaga and Dave Grohl. Cars remains a classic and a testament to Numan's innovation and vision as a musician, leaving an indelible mark that will continue to shape the soundscape for generations to come. Gary Numan is